Not long ago, yet if you measured time in years, but yet long enough ago that it exists mostly in memory, there was a wonderful world. Its people were wayward, witty, and wicked. Most of them were merely profane, outrageously impulsive, and extraordinarily talented. All of them were gifted in one respect. They had a tremendous zest for the enjoyment of life. Inevitably, they all came together, almost as members of a club, and we will hear them as they remember one of their most beloved members and the wonderful world of Robert Benchley. This is Biography in Sound. Tonight transcribed, The Wonderful World of Robert Benchley.
Benchley was a part of a great many people, and thus to a rare degree people of all kinds felt that they had a peculiarly personal share of him. He had enough warm friends to garnish and decorate 9 lives.
Bob, on walking into any room, made people happy, but he did not like a certain attitude that sometimes people in a room would have towards him, which was sort of be funny at once.
I never saw him do anything cruel in his sense of humor. It was always gentle and kind. If anybody was the butt, it was himself rather than any individual.
He had a wonderfully delicate and sympathetic understanding of our own frailties. And yet somehow he always identified himself with them, so that you were sharing something.
He could not be alone because he was too sad. And I knew that. That's why he was so helpful towards anyone.
You could say a million kind things about him.
Benchley underestimated his own abilities. He underestimated the quality of his work. He had true humility, and he was really great.
Tonight we have an especially appropriate narrator for our biography. He is the author and the playwright whose recent biography of his father is a fresh and fascinating picture of one of our greatest humorists. Here is Robert Benchley's eldest son, Nathaniel Benchley.
Probably the thing we'd better straighten out right off the bat is what to call my father. He had lots of names. Gramps, Robert, Bob, Bobby, Fred, Bench, Fluff, Chub. But for the next hour, just to keep straight whose story this is, I'll refer to my father as Robert Benchley. A good place to start might be the day he was born. That was September 15th, 1889. The place, Worcester, Massachusetts. As a boy, he was gay and comical, often used to amuse his classmates by illustrating the textbooks in school. And if the drawings weren't bad, they also weren't very good. Everybody looked Irish, even the Romans. He was interested in acting and would serve as an extra when some repertory company was in town. And he often made as much as 25 cents a performance. Sports, no, although he was a loyal and enthusiastic fan. Mostly he studied and read everything in sight. In 1907, in his junior year in high school, he transferred to a private school, and there he met a classmate who became a lifelong friend, Oscar Hauserman.
I first met Benchley in my senior year at Exeter Academy. He was there just for that year. He wasn't so very well known. He was a rather shy sort of fellow, a little taller than average height, slender, and wore a high collar that reminded you of Herbert Hoover. He came down to Harvard, unknown, shy, with a vague idea that when he finished college, he'd like to go into social service work. He was a serious reader. He didn't drink or smoke, and started in at an unknown freshman. But in rather short due course, certainly by the time he'd gotten well into his sophomore year, the classmates began to realize that Benchley was in a class by himself. All classes at the college, the hellions and the good boys who made up the majority, and the Phi Beta Kappa men all regarded Benchley as something special. In other words, there was the one and only Bob Benchley, no one like him. He was very popular because he had a happy disposition, and he was very genuine in making you feel that you were much funnier than he was. And that was natural and real. In due course, he made, as we say, the Lampoon. And he became president of the Harvard Lampoon. And at least 3 of the issues of the Lampoon during his presidency went into a large number of extra editions. They were unusually amusing and received national acclaim. And it was his regime that put the Harvard Lampoon back onto its feet.
Another long and exceptionally rewarding friendship was formed when Benchley met Glorious Williams, who was later to illustrate all of his books. Mr. Williams recalls,
I first came to know Benchley at the Harvard Lampoon. He had a gift for comic expression and comic action, and his drawings were not like anyone else's, and they were always funny.
One day he did a dinky little drawing, and they ran it on the cover, perhaps 3 inches square.
another classmate at Harvard, Paul Hollister.
It showed a silly little pie-faced scholar, a little Rollo in a roundabout cloth hat, walking a path which makes a detour around a big fat rock. Little Rollo has paused, and he says, in effect, how fortunate that the glacial activity deposited this boulder at the side of the path. Probably 90% of Harvard decided that the Lampoon had really outdone itself in obscurity. But to me, that picture says that all the obstacles, the glacial obstacles in the path of Bob Benchley's own career, were actually deposited at the side of the path he chose. He made a new sort of path, one that got around stuffiness and stupidity and avarice and fake and bad taste.
On the Harvard Lampoon, Robert Benchley distinguished himself primarily as a cartoonist, and drawing really was his first love. He considered himself an artist rather than a writer. Glorious Williams tells us,
What really happened was that his turning from drawing into writing was an entirely natural process that evolved of itself. His early contributions were entirely those one-line jokes that usually consisted of 2-3 words. Gradually, you'll notice if you look through those old volumes how the captions began to get longer. I remember there was one of a customs inspector inspecting a traveler's trunk. And the line was, Inspector says, you say you have nothing dutiable to declare except wearing apparel. What do you call these bottles of whiskey? And the inspected answers, nightcaps, my good man, nightcaps. But that was, Benchley was on his way as a writer. From then on, the captions took over and the drawings began to be of minor importance.
In the spring of his senior year at Harvard, Robert became engaged to Gertrude Darling. They had known each other since they were 8, and even as children, Robert made his intentions clearly known. Once in Worcester, he and a friend were standing on a street corner, and Gertrude walked by. The friend said, "There goes my brother's new girl." "Like hell she is," Robert replied, and that settled that. Robert and Gertrude were married in June of 1914. The following year, in November, I was born, and 4 years later, my brother Bob. Benchley's remark about traveling with children came from experience and is well known. Deems Taylor tells us.
In America, there are 2 classes of travel. First class and with children. Travel with children corresponds roughly to traveling third class in Bulgaria. And he also adds that Bulgaria is supposed to have the worst train system in the world.
As the boys grew up, Benchley was only a moderate disciplinarian. Once when my mother told him I was failing mathematics at school, he replied, if he passed it, he'd be no son of mine. And my brother recalls,
the only bit of discipline that I remember his giving either my brother or myself occurred when we were fairly young, and we'd been in the habit of biting our fingernails for a number of years. And my mother finally gave up on her end of the discipline and decided it was time for my father to take over. And he ushered us into a back room and made both of us extend all of our fingers, saying, let me see those nails. And after close inspection, he put out one of his own and said, see if you can bite one down as far as this. Now, we knew perfectly well what he meant, and it worked for several weeks.
One of Benchley's earliest jobs was a reporter on the New York Herald Tribune. He was, as he put it later, the worst reporter, even for his age, in New York City. The trouble was that he just couldn't bring himself to ask people things he considered none of his business. Happily, after 3 months, he was transferred from the daily paper to the Sunday magazine section. And there he fell into exceptionally good company.
James Taylor speaking. I first met Bob Benchley in 1916, when the two of us were the staff of the then newly organized Sunday magazine section, consisting of 4 pages, now better known as This Week. We were presided over by Art Falwell. Well, he was our boss. I don't know what his title was. He has been doing, incidentally, the text for Mr. and Mrs. for the last 30 years. Our duties were to read proof, make up the Sunday section, get illustrations, and write one funny piece a week. Well, Benchley and I worked out a system of that. We'd write our funny piece and then read it to the other. And if you got one laugh, and then it went in. If you didn't get one laugh, it was thrown out and you had to do another one. The deadline for the Sunday magazine section was Thursday morning at 5 o'clock. And, of course, we had all week to work on these pieces. So you can readily understand that we started to write about 4 o'clock Wednesday afternoon, and sometimes managed to end about 1 minute past 5 Thursday morning. I must say it's a hilarious experience. They let us do almost anything we chose. The Benchley of those days was so utterly different from the Benchley that we knew him last. Believe it or not, he used to carry around a little black notebook. And he'd open it, and you'd see car fare, 5 cents, paper, 1 cent, lunch, 65 cents. He kept care of every cent. And he didn't smoke, and he didn't drink. Altogether, I think Benchley was one of the most loved men that I've ever known. I can't imagine anybody being mad at Mr. Benchley. And Mr. Benchley, by the way, was the way all his intimates addressed him. Nobody ever called him Bobby, except people whom he didn't know very well.
Supervising this crew was the job of Arthur Falwell.
My job was really to assemble the section, put it together every week, to get artists and some writers. Naturally, we found that Benchley was one of the best. We had at that time quite a staff, that is, a small staff, James Taylor, Irwin Edmund, and Bob. He had a way of writing things such as this. He wondered if anybody ever really was found who was paged in a restaurant. When some boy would come through and say, call for Mr. Umlaut, call for Mr. Monhagen, so-and-so. And Benchley said, I wonder if anybody ever finds that man. So one week's assignment was to go around following that boy, see just whether he ever caught up with this inquiry. Sometimes he did. And anyway, it had made a good piece of nonsense. Benchley was excellent at that sort of thing. Benchley never showed his serious side. At least if he did, that was shown to me. Mm-hmm. He had a laugh which was absolutely beyond compare. And it was a great, big, deep, roistering laugh that would take you right off your feet.
In addition to his work at the Tribune, Benchley would occasionally sell a piece to Collier's or Vanity Fair. It was at Vanity Fair that he got his first experience as a theater critic. Of Benchley as a critic, Miss Patricia Collins recalls.
He never said a hurtful thing about an actor. Sometimes in criticism it's easy to take the clever, witty thing to say, and it's lovely in print, but the actor goes around with that print on his forehead for a long time before he can erase it. Bob never said anything that, even if you weren't very good, you couldn't help but feel that, well, he had something, you know, and it was helpful, as it was constructive always, but always kind. And I remember I was telling him how much I appreciated it and how much all the actors I knew appreciated it. And then he was talking about writing criticism, and I remember he said, anybody can write an adverse criticism. The difficult thing is to write a rave. And I think he meant that there's a temptation on either side to go overboard in praise, as one might be tempted to go overboard in criticism, adverse criticism. I think he was an especially selective writer. He never wanted to use a word that had not its own integrity, and so that he never, I think, threw adjectives around. If he said a thing was good, he meant it was good. And there were some of his contemporaries who were, well, they were given to dancing in the streets over things or throwing their hats in the air. But it was done with a certain amount of frequency, so that when Robert Benchley, well, if he gave you a little tip of the hat or made one small pirouette on the sidewalk, you felt you had received a great, great deal. He was a wonderful person.
I'll never forget his review of Eleanor Duse.
Deems Taylor.
Because when I first heard the praises of this woman, I had not seen her. And I thought she must be greatly overrated. And now, here I am with my head in my hand and nothing to say.
Being a dramatic critic, he'd have to be up late at night, so he couldn't get out to his home after shows until the wee small hours. And so he got an apartment in New York, which became about as public as the Grand Central Station.
Oscar Hauserman.
People that he hardly knew would come there and practically use it as their base of operations in New York.
In the late 20s, Benchley joined the staff of The New Yorker. At first, he wrote only a column called The Wayward Press, but he later succeeded Charles Brackett as drama critic. The problem of getting his copy in was indeed a problem, as Hobart G. Weeks recalls.
We were printed, still are printed, in the country, so we're at the mercy of train schedules and messengers. That was the reason that our deadlines were very important to us. If you missed a certain train, there was no way you could get the copy up to the plant. Mr. Benchley, like so many writers, was suspicious of deadlines and never believed that any of our deadlines were true ones. Actually, we've always been possibly exceptional in giving authors a true deadline. For Mr. Benchley, we were driven to the point of setting up dummy deadlines, fake deadlines for him to shoot at and miss, and he, of course, being an ingenious man, would usually outwit us, and so we spent hours waiting for copy. At this time, he mostly was living or writing in the Hotel Royalton, which was only a few steps from our office. And there he would call himself up. He would have a rather elfin man called McGregor, who was his go-between. We had a scrupulously polite man named Bob Haig, who was our go-between. McGregor and Haig would exchange dishonesties while the rest of us sat and glowered, waiting for the copy. It would be promised. The time would arrive. We would call up. Mr. Benchley would say he couldn't go any further unless he had a copy of the magazine. Hours would pass. Then he'd say the copy was ready. We'd send over a boy. We would find one paragraph written. Mr. Benchley had disappeared. One boy, Frank Grisades, the veteran I spoke to this morning, said he remembered putting in 6 hours waiting in the lobby of the Hotel Royalton, being increasingly hated by the bellboys, the elevator boys, and the desk clerks. He said he slept most of the time. One occasion, I tired of sending over boys who were always sent back, being told Mr. Benchley hadn't been there for days, although we just talked to him on the phone. I went over myself. I stopped at the desk. They said Mr. Benchley hadn't been there for days. I said, "Will they please tell Mr. Benchley that Weeks was here and he'd come to collect the copy and had to have it?" Mr. Benchley said, "Sent down word, come on up." So I went up and so entered the now famous room. I've been asked to describe the room many times, and because of what occurred, I've never been able to as clearly as I would like to. I remember there was a small lobby in which Uncle Bob greeted me with all signs of delight. The copy, he explained, wasn't quite ready, but he would finish it if I would have a seat. The room looked to me like a room of a freshman at Harvard, I would think, in the period of about 1910. It was rather bleakly but thoroughly furnished. There was a table in the middle on which there was a pile of vie Parisienne. There was a sort of couch on which there was a banjo. He asked me to sit on the couch, brought out scotch, water, and ice, told me to make myself at home, and went off in the corner and began writing his piece. I got into the vie Parisiennes, and I'm afraid also into the scotch. And the result of all this, in the end, when I returned to the office, the question was no longer why was Mr. Benchley late. The question was where on earth had I been all this time. He was ingenious in leading people astray that way in order to avoid turning in his copy himself or fulfilling a commitment which he didn't wish to keep at the moment.
How come he wasn't fired if his copy was that hard to get?
The real reason we spent so much time worrying was that we wanted his copy. It was without parallel. It was, in fact, superb. And any time we had either a wayward press or a theater, or preferably both, we knew we had a good issue of the magazine.
The 1920s were, for people in Benchley's general category, a vibrant and exciting time. There was an air of daring and rejoicing and rebelling. There was a period of group activity. And one such group to which Robert Benchley belonged was the famous Round Table, which had its headquarters at Frank Case's Hotel Algonquin. One member of that group was a young actress named Peggy Wood.
In the 20s, then, there was a great boiling up of talent, of literary talent. And it was the renaissance of poetry. And it was the dramatic criticisms were excellent. And there was a real flair, a release, I think, after the war, which did not come quite so much after this war. But at any rate, it found its expression in a group of young people who were such good friends, and they were so congenial, and their personalities fitted in so much with each other that I think out of that whole group in the Round Table, I never knew of a row. When I think back over, that's the first time I've ever thought of that. There never was anybody who was at loggerheads with anybody else. There were never any feuds going on. They were all joyously delighted in each other's company and each other's abilities, and they all respected each other for their abilities, too. It was called the Round Table for one very simple reason. It was round. And it had started out as a sort of longish table in the corner of the room, and there's where I was first introduced to it, and I was the only woman there for a long time. But that was because I was also a working woman. I wasn't taken there particularly for my wit, but I was part of the theater, and I came in during rehearsal times, or the Round Table was at the Algonquin, and that was the center of the theater and artistic world, that is, as far as the literary world that impinged on the theater. There might be at some time 12 or 15 people there, or there might be only 3. Nobody ever made a luncheon engagement. You came in if you were in the vicinity, and you sat down to listen to what was going on and the latest talk. I won't say gossip, because gossip columns hadn't begun then, and what went on in the way of talk was literary theatrical gossip and musical gossip, press agent gossip. But it was all done in terms of news and friendliness. And the wits that were there made their remarks great fun. Now, they didn't try to outbang each other too much, Of course, they did, but they didn't just wait until you got through with what you were going to say and then slay you with what they had been saving up. They listened, and that was the one thing that was so wonderful about Benchley. I think he always made you feel that you were really quite worth listening to. And in the round table, they were all good audiences for each other. Wolcott, Broome, Deems Taylor, of course, Benchley, Murdoch Pemberton, Brock Pemberton, Lawrence Stallings, who wrote Pice Glory, Max Anderson, all kinds of people came and introduced, and I met my husband there, John B.A. Weaver. And we were regular parishioners, as we might say. The remembrances crowd in, yes, but they crowd in with mingled delight and regret, because it is heartbreaking to think that I shall not see that merry face again.
That the thing that impressed me then, and always did impress me most about him, was his gentleness, his kindliness, and his very warm and loving heart. Because we all knew he was funny, and we adored that, but he had all these other attributes that don't always go with wit. His wit can be quite sharp and ruthless at times.
One time, the Round Table group decided to put on a play, which they would write and act in themselves, and to which they would invite their friends, most of them theatrical professionals. Since the Round Tablers couldn't guarantee the quality of the performance, they said that they themselves would buy the seats and give them out to their friends. Benchley was called on to do a skit, but forgot on his way to the rehearsal that he had planned nothing, so pretended he had misunderstood. And when he got to rehearsal, he got up and gave a parody of a treasurer's report. It worked so well that they included it in the show. And in the audience that night was Irving Berlin.
I told Sam Harris about it. Sam said, let's try and get him for the next Music Box review. I spoke to Benchley about this, then went off to Atlantic City to work on the show. In a few days, I got a note from Bob saying, in effect, Dear Irving, I've considered your offer and will go in the next Music Box show, but my salary is $500 a week. Incidentally, you and Sam would be very foolish to pay it. Of course, Sam and I were happy to pay it, and Bob was not alone one of the best-liked members of the cast, but was one of the real high spots of the third Music Box review.
And that was how Benchley the cartoonist, the writer, and the critic became Benchley the actor.
He was a delicious actor. He was unique, you know.
Margalo Gilmore.
I think he enjoyed acting. I think it was a release to him from the organized life of a writer, which has to be more or less always on its own and by itself. And he liked the camaraderie of the theater. And, of course, he liked the fact that he was a great success at it. It was a nice combination, too.
This is Biographies in Sound, and you are listening to The Wonderful World of Robert Benchley. Part 2 will continue after a 10-second pause for station identification. The Wonderful World of Robert Benchley, Part 2. Tonight's Biography in Sound.
During the 20s along 49th Street, where the RCA building stands today, there used to be a fabulous street called Speakeasy Row. Speakeasy was not only a place to drink. It was a kind of club, a place to meet your friends, a place that gave you, in a certain sense, a feeling of belonging. As Lois Long recalls,
Tony's was a little bit of a basement joint, but it was tremendously popular with young actors and actresses like Libby Holman, who was starring then in the little show, and Alice Brady used to come in, and Dwight Deere Wyman, and of course Benchley was there, always the center of some mad frolic or other. It was quite a place. It was much more social to be unhappy in your club, and everyone had a club, and I think it's a great loss that everyone doesn't have one now.
the host at this particular club was a restaurateur named Tony Soma. Tony?
Mr. Benchley to me was always, I would say, a friend, not just a customer, because he had taken the habit ever since 1976. It wasn't a single day that he would not come in. Especially, he would never go to bed unless he has paid a visit to our club. And not because of myself, but because I would say the people he used to work with, all the family of the early New Yorker, the founders of the New Yorker, the Fashions, Peter Arno, Lois Long, who became Mrs. Arno, Harold Ross, Thurber, Dorothy Parker was a member of that company, and
Connolly, and Ogden Stewart, Brune, of course, theatrical people they used to meet there. And he was very always upset if ever those actors and actresses that he used to meet there, he had to say something unpleasant. He always managed more or less whenever he reviewed a play, a musical comedy or drama, he always managed to say something worthwhile. That is, he never blamed the play and probably the play as being no good or the producer being wrong or anything. He always found ways and means to say something pleasant. He was a humanist.
Another old friend of Benchley's was this familiar voice.
This is Jimmy Durante, folks. I first met Robert at the Club Durant in New York City, right off Broadway on 58th Street. And that started off a fine friendship between Robert and myself. I used to always go to Robert for advice. Anything that I'd do, I'd go to Robert and see if it was the right thing to do, and he would always come through. Robert at that time came up there, and I'll never forget the first write-up that he gave us. I think it was in the Bookman. And the three of us tried to understand what he wrote. The words were so big that we put an ad in the paper. We put an ad in Variety, at least, asking Robert, was it a knock or a boost? And he came up that day and he explained it all, and it turned out to be the greatest rave Clayton Jackson or Durante ever got.
Often the sound of a boat's whistle was enough to prompt Benchley into a trip to Europe. He might be going down to the dock just to see friends off and end up going along for the ride. He loved boats, probably because they contrived against him far less than most means of transportation. On one of his impromptu European jaunts, he met the motion picture director and producer Louis Milestone.
On the return to New York, he invited me to come to see him. He lived at the Royalton Hotel, and anybody who knew Bob Benchley knew the Royalton Hotel and knew this fantastic suite of rooms that he had in this hotel. On an afternoon in Mr. Benchley's suite, you could meet Jock Whitney, Ernest Hemingway, or you could meet Mike Romanoff, who is now a very successful restaurateur. This is the room in which he lived, the suite in which he lived. This is where he worked. An anecdote about Benchley comes to my mind. He detested birds, and very often he would work in his living room in the Royalton Hotel, and if a little robin would sit on the window, Benchley would start a whole feud with him. When I asked him once why he disliked the birds, and he said, because this little robin is a very fresh bird, and he says, he sits on the window and interferes with my work. And if I say to him, go away, do you think he'd go away? No. He jumps into the middle of the room, puts his little hands behind his back, advances menacingly, and says, what did you say? He says, that's the robin for you.
Another person he met in the 1920s was that bon vivant of dubious royalty, Prince Michael Romanoff.
Wherever he was, many people would gather around him, anything from 5 to a dozen. At those times, Benchley was the listener rather than the talker. And he had an infectious laugh, which pleased his listeners. At other times, where there was only 2 or 3, then he would talk, and they were mostly close friends.
Another of the merry group was Gene Fowler.
I suppose all writers have feelings toward their craft and their own attitudes, and I think, and a great many others think, that if you don't approach it with humility, that you don't have a real flair for writing. Now, there are men who act in an arrogant fashion, but I think that's a cover-up. I believe that any man who sits before a blank piece of paper has a form of stage fright. It's a horrible thing, especially if your mind is blank, too. But Benchley wrote slowly and thought carefully when he wrote. To read what he wrote, it sounds as if it just tripped right off, but he was very careful. I think that he wanted to write things other than the comic. I believe that what he did was eminently fine and great, no matter what his secret yearnings or doubts were, because his copy is beautifully done. People look at the wit and they overlook the fact that it's well constructed and real and basically honest, if we may use that term in comedy. Although he verged on travesty, underneath it was a great deal of feeling. And I don't think he was always gay. I don't think anyone is always gay. I think he kept that face to the world, and I think he was conscious of the fact he was regarded as a wit and had to say something funny all the time. Well, he wasn't always saying something funny. He was a deep-feeling man, had great convictions, and at times in crusades took firm stands whether they were popular or not.
Just about everybody who knew him has his favorite Benchley anecdote. Mrs. Nicholas Luddington recalls the turmoil he would cause at the Bankers Trust Company.
He was sitting in a restaurant with a gay little group and found that he was without any funds to pay for the drinks that were being served. So he called for a check, and on the check he wrote, "Dear Bankers Trust, I love you," signed Peter Rabbit. The check, incidentally, went through, and he had it framed in his room at the Royalton Hotel.
An encounter with another bank brought about this Mark Connolly story.
One time, I spent the night with him up in Scarsdale. And in those days, his income wasn't very large. And he wanted to meet some forthcoming impending obligations, I think some payment on the house or something. And he went over to the Scarsdale Bank, and I just trailed along and happened to overhear all this. And he walked in and quite easily got a loan, I think, of about $5,000. Somewhat to his surprise and relief. We got on the train, come to town, and Bobby began musing about this, about how easy it had been. And he called on me to recall how he had simply shaken hands with the president of the bank and told him who he was and how the loan had been given him with very little paperwork. And finally, Bobby says, I wonder if that bank practices its business as loosely as that generally. I wonder whether it really does. What do you think? And we finally agreed that it must be a pretty shaky institution, you know, if they were taking such wildcat chances as that. So Benchley went out the next day and took his money out.
The one thing Robert Benchley wanted more than anything else was to be a good, serious writer. Until his death, he collected voluminous notes on a project which he always considered his serious work, a study of literature during the Queen Anne period, but it was never completed. It was never even started, really. Possibly because at one point he was writing 3 syndicated columns a week, doing the theater reviews for the New Yorker, appearing in a weekly radio show, and making shorts and full-length pictures in Hollywood. He was tagged as a funny man, and a very funny man he was, in an entirely original way. Deems Taylor.
It's hard to analyze Benchley's humor because you can't pin him down. Generally speaking, I'd say that he lets you anticipate something and then destroys the anticipatiousness, or double crosses you. There's always the extreme element of shock and surprise, and also delight. And he was equally funny in all branches, even for the titles of his book. But he had a faculty of just putting down ordinary events with great solemnity, and yet somehow making them completely hilarious. He wrote a very instructive series of opera synopses. There was one, a Wagnerian affair. It's pretty involved. I haven't time to give you the plot, but you can get a slight idea from the table, the cast, among whom were Strudel, the god of rain, and Schmaltz, the god of a slight drizzle, and Woodpecker, a soprano. You may remember the famous Spanish chanteuse Rachel Meller, who made a great specialty of singing Spanish folk songs. And as she sang only in Spanish, the management printed a brief synopsis of every song in the program. So Benchley helpfully contributed a few. Among one called La Lavandera, the laundry man, which it is not, starts off, a coquette pretending to be angry bites off the hand of her lover up to the wrist. And another gem called La Guya, the timetable. It is the day of the bullfight in Madrid. Everyone is cockeyed. The bull has slipped out by the back entrance to the arena and has gone home disgusted. Nobody notices that the bull has gone except Nina, who has come to town that day to sell her father. He has another about a Spanish girl whose father was president of the First National Banco.
He rarely repeated. He was never a man who was funny for the sake of being funny.
Pat Collins.
a humorous remark came out of him absolutely spontaneously. So that I think it was probably later he began to think that would make the piece and wrote it.
Today, in New York's Restaurant 21, there is inscribed on a plaque over a certain table, Robert Benchley, his corner. And his corner it was, because he spent a lot of time at 21 and is fondly remembered there.
My name is Mac Crindler, one of the brothers Crindler of the 21 Club. Benchley would gather with his cronies. He's got a compendium of all the humorists and all the gay working people of our city, i.e. the Fourth Estate and these writers and artists of every description. Well, it was our favorite customer, his rather, and he introduced it. To close the place, which we normally did at 1 o'clock in the morning, and then we'd bring a piano down from the second floor. Benchley loved German songs. He knew a lot of them. And that's where my brother and he would compete, you see. Although my vocabulary was not as keen or as broad as theirs, I liked to sing, so that we made a happy trio. Of course, anyone else could join in if they wished, which they did. And this would go on for 2, 3, 4 hours. It wasn't just the singing, but the wonderful conversation that flowed from it. It was a wonderful spirit of camaraderie. He lived a very happy, broad life, and I shall always remember him fondly, as all of us do at 21.
I am Bob Crindler, youngest member of the Crindler family. Bob Benchley was extremely kind to me. I had developed a hobby of collecting inscribed first editions of authors who frequented 21. And of all the authors who came in during the early period of my association with 21, I would say 95% were either in the company of Bob Benchley or were brought in by him. Mr. Benchley knew of this desire of mine to collect inscribed first editions, and it was through his kindness that I met persons such as Sinclair Lewis, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, and so many others.
My name is Remo Revel. I've been connected with the 21 Club for the past 28 years.
Remo Revel, captain of waiters.
I remember one time, this happened to be Christmas. The place was not even open, and they came in through the side door. We opened the door, and who was there? Mr. Benchley. We told him that the place was not open. And his reply was, well, at this time I'm not looking for the bar. I come in to see you especially. And like Santa Claus, he gave us a $10 gold piece to each favorite waiter. Of course, at that time we used to be in Ghost Center. And I still have this piece with me, which I cherish all the time.
Since June of 1926, Benchley had been going to Hollywood from time to time, either to write dialogue or subtitles for pictures, or to act in one of the 50 or so movie shorts he made. He also appeared in a lesser capacity in about 40 feature pictures. He set up housekeeping in a place with the improbable name of the Garden of Allah on Sunset Boulevard. Paul Hollister recalls visiting him there.
The years the man lived in Hollywood, I saw something of him, as the saying goes. He lived in a sort of Moorish cement palace on Sunset called the Garden of Allah. He always kept a large suitcase packed in his bedroom, ready for instant flight from Allah to New York. Many think of Benchley as that funny fat man whom they saw being awkward in the movies. His first movie, which, by the way, was the first film ever made in which the human voice was heard for more than 1 minute, coming from a person on the screen, this is the treasurer's report, I asked whether he would go back to the New Yorker to review shows. Oh, God, no, he said rapidly in that nice, flat Worcester dialect. Wolcott Gibbs is doing far better, so far better than I ever could. This is the same Benchley of whom the famous Copy, Professor Charles Townsend Copeland of Harvard, said, "Watch him. Read him. He is the most diabolically skillful critic of our time."
Crossing Sunset Boulevard is a hazardous expedition for anybody. It was especially perilous for Benchley because traffic plotted against him. Margot Gilmore remembers how he solved this particular problem.
Well, this was the big problem of his life when he lived out in Hollywood at the Garden of Allah. And he had some friends who lived right across the street in the Chateau Marmont. And he used to want to go over and see them, but he was scared to death to cross Sunset Boulevard with the cars racing down. So he used to call a taxi and tell the taxi to take him to Ciro's. And he'd tell the taxi driver he had a friend in the bar who was waiting for him. Then he'd get out, go in, come out again, and tell the taxi driver that his friend had left, and had left where to pick him up at Chateau Marmont, and that's how he crossed Sunset Boulevard. And I don't blame him much. I've often thought I'd like to do it that way.
In addition to his acting and his writing, Robert Benchley was a frequent guest on radio programs. Here's a typical recording of one of his guest shots.
Ladies and gentlemen, the subject of my discourse tonight is crooning. Now, as you all know, the human throat is made up of 3 parts. 1, the larynx, 2, the pharynx, and 3, the Adam's apple. The Adam's apple, of course, is the most important part of a crooner's throat, as it is the part on which the bow tie rests. Now, the ordinary singer sings with his mouth open, thusly. You notice how unpleasant that is? But the crooner sings thusly, which is just as unpleasant but harder to hear. Now, another important part of the crooner is the jukebox. It is estimated, and I quote, that in the 12-month period from 1939 to 1944, Americans, or people of American descent, put into jukeboxes a total of 19,742,000 nickels and 5 cents. And I unquote. Another phenomenon in connection with crooning is the growth of what is known as the bobby sock. That's no relation. In line with this, the noted psychologist at the Psychology Institute, Psychology, Pennsylvania, the head of the outpatient department, Dr. Eric Hoffenstürmer, said, quote, "It could happen to you." Unquote. Dr. Hoffenstürmer, incidentally, has just left the Institute and is now singing at the Orpheum under the name of Perry Hoffenstürmer. Velvet rhythm, you know. The 2 leading crooners of the day are Mr. Frank Sinatra and Mr. Bing Crosby. Mr. Sinatra has a huge following, which is highly enthusiastic about his singing, causing them to emit such cries as... Now, I have here a chart which I have just run off on my automatic pencil. Here is a red line which begins at the figure 100,000 and ends in July. From July to 200,000, we have a blue line, which is joined at point X here by another blue line, whereupon both blue lines curve back into the red line, and here we say bye-bye blues. Now, there are various other lines here scooting up and down across the page, but these lines mean nothing. They're left over from an old chart of mine on birth rate and maternity wards.
One evening in November of 1945, Robert Benchley attended a dinner party at the home of his friend, Mac Crindler.
It was towards the end of the dinner, and he excused himself and was gone for some little time when Nat, his son, who was at this dinner, became concerned, of course, went down to find out what happened to Bob. He came back and said that it was required that Bob would be taken to the hospital immediately. John McLean was also one of the guests, and Nat took Bob to the hospital. We finished our dinner and then proceeded to the hospital, where we were advised that he was desperately ill.
He died at 6 in the morning on November 21st.
And when he died, about 25 of us who had been among his intimate friends at various intervals, instead of going to the funeral, we hired an upstairs dining room in the 21 Club and staged a rollicking, alcoholic party for our beloved Robert. And I'm sure that he had a good time.
He died much too soon for anybody's use or purpose. With all his sadnesses, his path was really a magnificent meander.
You have been listening to Biography in Sound, and tonight's transcribed account of the wonderful world of Robert Benchley.